Hey everyone, welcome back. This week we are thinking about a couple of very contemporary topics and topics that are no strangers to modern political discussion and discourse. Some topics that I think really get to the heart of a lot of media criticism today and a lot of consternation, a lot of concerns I think that many observers, many Americans have in the modern period. And of course, our discussion is centered on both discussions of bias in the media sphere, which we'll get to a little bit later in some separate communications, and the idea of misinformation, or that is instances in which the American public simply doesn't know the truth about something, learn something in a way that deviates from that objective reality, and then expresses opinions that are based on that lack of a factual understanding of what's happening. And I think in this short video, I want to take some time to really think about definitions and ask ourselves if we can distinguish between different reasons why Americans might get it wrong, so to speak. And if we think about the first potential reason for this, we have to fall back on a question that is much older, maybe, than this more modern literature as you're reading this week on misinformation, on bias, and on a lack of public competence in understanding what's going on today in politics. And that is ultimately this question: does the average American actually know much about the world of politics? And in what ways do Americans sort of fall short of an objective standard of political knowledge? And this has been a question that has occupied scholars at least since the 1960s, earlier than that as well. But since the advent of more modern survey techniques, we've really focused on trying to understand: what do Americans know? How do they know things, and what kinds of specific knowledge do they possess? And researchers in the 60s were pretty shocked to discover that actually Americans don't know a tremendous amount about politics. And in specific terms, they actually fail to know some basic things, both about formal institutions, about ideologies, and about actors and events. So that's a lot of different layers of a lack of knowledge. Okay, so in terms of, we're not really talking about misinformation here. We're actually just talking about a lack of information writ large. So one thing is the fact that Americans seemingly didn't pay much attention to Schoolhouse Rock and to their civics classes in high school or whatnot. A lot of Americans don't understand how the formal institutions of American government work. So, for example, they don't understand our bicameral Congress, the House and the Senate, and how those two bodies interact. They don't understand the checks and balances of the federal system, with the presidency and Congress and the judicial branch, or at least the Supreme Court, acting as this kind of judicial check on these other powers in government. They don't understand much about federalism or about the interplay between state governments and the federal government. I mean, there's a lot of things that are missing from many Americans' basic understanding of government. So much so that I actually really like this idea, or at least I like the title. Maybe the implications of the idea are a little more worrying, but a few people have gone on to argue that many Americans suffer from what's called the Green Lantern theory of the presidency, or the Green Lantern theory of American politics, which is that the president is kind of this infinitely powerful figurehead, and whatever the president wants to do, they can do it. Kind of like the Green Lantern's power is, with the Green Lantern ring, whatever the Green Lantern imagines can become reality. That's certainly not the way that our extremely gridlocked political system works, but you start to understand a little bit about why Americans get so upset at presidents and why they place both blame and credit at the feet of presidents when very complex things are happening in both the political and the economic and social world out there. But beyond that, right, beyond just a lack of understanding of these formal rules and the formal institutions and how things work, basically, in government, Americans often don't have a clear understanding of the ideological stances of parties and partisans. I will say that is something that has trended towards the positive for for various reasons in recent times, many Americans are starting to better understand where the two parties stand relative to one another. But still, a substantial proportion of Americans don't understand really what it means to be liberal or conservative, what they are ideologically, and really where the two parties stand either. To them, the two parties it's very hard for them to differentiate what their ideologies really are. And so without that kind of conceptual roadmap to understanding how political actors are different in terms of their beliefs, values, and commitments, it becomes a very confusing thing for Americans to understand. Beyond that, a lot of Americans don't know who these actors are, who these actual people are who are occupying important seats of government. So they can't identify a Ted Cruz, or they can't identify, an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or they, can't identify a Joe Biden even really, or a Pete Buttigieg, or anybody who's involved in the cabinet right now. They can't name their governor, right? They can't name the vice president, Kamala Harris. They have a really hard time understanding who's who and what those roles are ultimately that those people are filling. So, when they hear news about these people, they say, okay, well, why is this person relevant to me? What are they doing? And critically, they might even also say, well, why isn't this person doing a job that actually they're not supposed to be performing? So again, we talked a little bit about the confusion of federalism, where Americans have a hard time understanding the difference between the federal level and the state level. I saw an article recently where people in the comments, or people on Twitter, were getting mad at a senator for not fixing the conditions in that senator's state. And some political science observers had to sort of kindly come along and say, the Senate, or people who occupy the seats in the Senate, are not directly involved with the day-to-day political decision-making of their states, right? They're not like some kind of actor that has the ability to change what's going on in their state. They're representing the state in, again, the national Congress. You'd want to maybe check in with the governor and maybe the state legislature of that state to understand why things are happening the way that they are in that particular state. So not understanding the actors, not understanding the rules of the game together, that can mean that Americans are really misled about what's really going on. And that even goes not far enough, because we also have to remember that Americans have a very hard time understanding or even recalling recent events, and even surprisingly recent events. I think that it's telling that in the in many surveys, actually, we see that if we ask Americans, like, who was responsible for the Great Recession, right, of 2008, a lot of Americans will say, oh, Obama was responsible for the Great Recession, but Obama wasn't in office when the stock market collapsed. That was actually prior to his inauguration. It's actually not, right? Inauguration actually happens after. So this was in 2009 when Obama actually takes office in January. So Americans don't understand and don't remember these recent events as well. They have a sort of lack of news literacy. And so there's really a big dearth of just understanding about how things work in general and about the nitty-gritty details of recent history. And so, again, this is really partially because a lot of Americans don't have a tremendous amount of interest in the world of politics. And this can be really captured, I think, nicely by a concept called rational ignorance, which is to say we can't really blame people for not knowing all of this stuff, because, why would you do that if you didn't have a rational incentive to do so, right? It speaks to a broader collective action problem. If every single American were fully informed about every facet of American politics, yes, our country would probably look a little bit different than it does today. However, people have other things to do, right? If you're not going to be the one individual to fix this overall problem by hitting the books and spending an entire year or something reading civics textbooks, right? You got to put food on the table. You got to go to your job or your jobs, plural in America. You've got to do maybe childcare and other kinds of unpaid labor for your family. You've got to go back to college, for example, and try to make it with a bachelor's degree, which is becoming more and more not just the gateway to more prosperity in American life, but actually an important roadblock to people, because if you don't have it, then you're really, really in trouble. And so, there could be a lot of reasons why rational ignorance would be proliferating in American society, simply because we have many other better things to do than pay attention to what's going on C-SPAN every day. And it makes sense. We can't blame people for that. It simply is their individual incentives are directing their attention elsewhere. But again, we could also point the finger at a lack of quality civics education, a lack of real attention to these issues in our curriculum. That could be a separate conversation as well. But all this to say, right, one of the most profound layers of this kind of discussion of misinformation is that Americans, by and large, don't have a lot of information to begin with. However, when they maybe go to try to inform themselves, it's possible that many Americans could come to claim that they have learned something about politics which is true, which turns out to in fact be not true. And so we can define or distinguish between a lack of information and misinformation. Misinformation really being the case when Americans think they know about politics, but they do not. And so this is what happens when an incorrect factual belief prevails in the public. And there are many examples of this where Americans, by and large, believe something to be true about politics, which is simply not true. And so, there are some examples of more benign, kind of less partisan instances of this, where just wide majorities of Americans believe things that aren't true. So, for example, Americans have a really poor understanding, on average, of the contours of the federal budget. For example, if we ask people on surveys, what percentage of the federal budget goes to foreign aid to other countries? A lot of Americans, through this kind of strange folk wisdom, this accumulated kind of a set of false assumptions, believe that or the federal government spends like 10, 20, 30% of the federal budget on aid to other countries. And of course, those of us who have seen this budget breakdown know that that's like not true at all, that foreign aid is an astronomically tiny percentage of the total pie, the total size of the pie of the federal budget. Other kinds of misperceptions related to the budget also persist, where people think that unemployment insurance, other kinds of welfare line items are like 90% of the budget, when of course they're way smaller. Most of the federal budget really breaks down. It's like the military, it's Medicare, and it's Social Security, right? Ultimately, in terms of the total budget and not just the discretionary amounts. But also, there's more things that Americans tend to get wrong. For example, a lot of Americans don't understand how the tax system works, like the graduated tax brackets. So there's this erroneous belief out there that you'll occasionally see where someone will say, oh, I'm not going to work overtime because if I do, I'll get bumped into a higher tax bracket and then I'll end up owing more in taxes than I would have made, which is completely false, right? Every dollar that you earn is taxed at a specific rate. And if you exceed a tax bracket, all of the income that's earned below that tax bracket is taxed at the lower rate. Any income that's earned above that bracket is taxed at the higher rate, which means that you're never losing out if you go into the next tax bracket. Still, many Americans persist in believing that to be true. This is another, I think, more politically benign, still consequential to people's wallets, right? But politically benign examples of this kind of misinformation. So simply, there are gaps in people's knowledge, and sometimes they're filled with information that is simply not true. And, again, for one reason why this might occur is, again, as I've said, kind of this benign folk wisdom, this idea that, your grandmother told you, don't go over the tax bracket. If you jump into the next tax bracket, you're going to owe Uncle Sam even more money. And, maybe some political scientist one day would kindly explain to that person that their grandma, despite being very well intentioned, was not correct about how tax brackets work, right? But also there's this problem of innumeracy, where Americans are really bad at math, really bad with numbers, and so that may allow some of those things to persist, because they might look at this and say, oh, I owed more than I did last year, without really remembering or understanding. Or maybe they made more money on the whole this year, and that ended up meaning that their effective tax rate was higher. It messes with people a lot. And so, again, this is not intentional. This is not a source of partisan influence. I think it's really just about Americans not truly understanding what's happening. And again, I think that these have political consequences, but not explicit and not explicitly partisan ones. However, of course, we know from our previous discussions over the last few weeks that there's some tough stuff out there in the information environment in terms of people attempting to deliberately influence our perceptions and potentially get us to think about things from an incorrect perspective. And so we could think about misinformation as being kind of erroneous, accidental mistakes that Americans make where they come to believe stuff that's not true through the basis of this folk wisdom or through the basis of fairly benign kinds of bias information acquisition. But disinformation we could think about as targeted attempts to get a wide swath of people to believe things that are not true for a politically motivated purpose. So this is, again, kind of going beyond framing. And again, last time we talked about a lot about framing. Framing is about presenting stories with certain emphases to try to get people to think about them from a specific perspective, right? This is more. This is saying we're going to go in and we're going to try to get you not to think about things with a specific lens or from a specific consideration, but to believe a story that is simply not true, that did not happen, to expose audiences to fully incorrect facts. And so a couple of years ago, for example, there was a very interesting case where there was a website that had been created and it was supposed to look exactly like, it would basically use the web template of a major French publication called Le Soir, the evening. And it had a fake article about something that Macron said. And at the end of the day, right, this thing, it was called like Le Soir, maybe it was SOLR, right? And so in a web browser, that link maybe looked very much like lesoir.com or .fr or whatever. It was intentionally designed to deceive. It was propagated through social media channels, and a lot of people came to believe a thing that was untrue about Emmanuel Macron. And so, again, these are targeted attempts to persuade through a falsified set of information. Bad actors out there in the media sphere can create these things and disseminate them with the express purpose of biasing public opinion against certain political actors. And so that's a really dangerous thing. And certainly, I'm not the first one to mention this to you, but again, I wanted to delineate between various reasons why people might not know things. Disinformation, misinformation, and a lack of information are all different sort of mechanisms to explain why Americans might not know what they should know about politics. But again, we also want to go further with this definition and think about malinformation. Okay, so malinformation is another form of targeted attempts to change people's opinions. But in this case, it's actually not disinformation, right? Where disinformation is changing presentation, or not changing presentation, but rather creating something fake and disseminating it to the public in a way that makes it look real. This is actually disseminating real information, but information that's being used in a malicious way with the intent to harm someone. So, for example, a leak could be an example of malinformation, using this malinformation in order to create a firestorm, in order to cause a controversy where none previously existed. And a lot of malinformation is about timing. So if there's been hacks, if there have been leaks, these kinds of things can be released before somebody can come along and explain maybe what's happening here, right? So even information that's relatively benign, when released strategically, can start to sound really bad or really dangerous. And again, these kinds of strategic information dumps can hit at exactly the right moment and cause a lot of people to start to doubt their previous attachment to political figures, to political movements. And again, a lot of this stuff is designed to sow doubt in people's minds. Because if we can get people to doubt, then that means that they might not be as excited about, might not be as willing to participate in politics, to be confident in their actions. And as a deterrent to political participation, that's just as good as changing people's minds and getting them to join the other side. If you can harm somebody's base turnout or base participation or base willingness to contribute to a campaign, that's still helping the candidate that you really want to win by virtue of harming that other candidate's chances. You don't need to get them to switch all the way to the other side. You really just need to dampen their enthusiasm for the election. And so again, a lack of information, misinformation, disinformation, and now malinformation are all ways that we can essentially come to have influences on our political participation, our political behavior, our public opinion, that stems ultimately from a lack of really objective and critical understanding of what's really happening in the world. And so I think I just want to leave you with a couple of questions. First of all, being to ask what journalists might do if they were to try to confront these phenomena of misinformation, of disinformation, even of malinformation. If we think about some journalists occupying, again, that social responsibility role and trying to perform that function for society, this is a major, dragon to try to slay ultimately in the media environment, in the media ecosystem. This is a very dangerous thing if you're a social responsibility journalist. And I think you have to wonder, right? What are some strategies that we can employ to try to combat the rise of these phenomena? Especially when we think about the emphasis that we've seen recently on the idea of fact checks. And as you go through the reading this week, I want you to really try to consider this, right? Can fact checks help us sort what's true and what's false? Again, in a deregulated world where online content is so highly proliferated. And of course, I want you to go into that reading thinking about these questions as you start to tackle ideas about like Section 230 and about fact checks and about other kinds of responses that the academic world and the journalistic world have thought about. And then finally, I want to really think about your own experience with media and to ask yourself this question, which is to say, have you fallen victim to this? Have you ever been exposed to instances of a lack of information or of misinformation, disinformation, even malinformation? And what do we think about those around us? And if we think that this is an issue, if we identify this as a potential problem, what can we do as individuals as well? Not just journalistic elites or political scientists or other concerned, actors. What can we as individuals in our daily lives do to try to inoculate ourselves from this kind of problem? Really some food for thought, and I hope that we can chew on this a little bit. Take care of the reading this week, and I really look forward to our discussion. I think it's going to be very fruitful and hopefully very interesting as we think about this big, thorny, pernicious problem in the media environment. All right, I'll see you next time.